And our first presentation is with Dr. James McGraw. And Dr. James McGraw is Professor Emeritus of Plant Population Biology and Ecology at West Virginia University. He received his BS in Biological Sciences from Stanford and his PhD in Botany from Duke. His ecological research has spanned field sites from Alaska to Colorado to Zimbabwe to Antarctica. And for the past 20 and more years, his major focus of his lab's work has been the study of valuable native medicinal plants of the eastern deciduous forest, especially American ginseng. And so without further ado, I present to you Dr. James McGraw.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Dakota, if you could confirm.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Welcome. I guess this is how seminars work in the age of COVID. So I'm going to talk to you about the most famous medicinal plant harvested on American soils. So now if I can only get there we go. So the outline of the talk, I kind of wanted to go through the life cycle of ginseng in case you're not familiar with it, where it grows, kind of the range of ginseng across North America, and then its habitat, as well as sort of microhabitat. And then a brief overview of the big three conservation challenges with American ginseng. And then finally, kind of what ginseng needs to thrive in the future. And that's where I think forest landowners and stewardship folks really can come in to be key in that. So I won't hesitate at all here. I only have 20 minutes. So ginseng is really very special, exceptionally special, but it's also extremely ordinary. I'm showing the life cycle here. It emerges as a new seedling with 3 leaflets. One slight oddity is it doesn't have cotyledons. They actually stay inside the seed when it germinates. And so the upper left photo is showing a new seedling. And then the next year or 2 years or 3 years, it will be an older 1-leaf plant. Finally, it will get enough energy in the root to become a juvenile, which has 2 leaves, which you can see in the middle top. And then depending upon the quality of the site, it will graduate to be an adult, which is reproductive potentially every year, although a lot of plants don't actually produce seeds every year. And so the adults can have 3 leaves or 4 leaves, or very rarely 5 leaves. And so that's kind of what the life cycle looks like overall. It produces berries like a lot of understory herbs. In the case of ginseng, the seeds are fairly large in those berries, and it can either have 1 seed or 2 seeds. And so you can actually see that from the outside of the berry based on the size. Okay. The time it takes to go through this life cycle varies from anywhere from 5 to 15 years to go from a new seedling to adult plants. We can summarize that life cycle by kind of putting each of those classes in boxes. And then I've added on the left side different classifications of age in the soil. So at any given time in the population, you'll have all of these classes, but also seeds in the soil that may be 9, 21, 33, or 45 months old as of May in any given year. And what the arrows are showing here is the transitions that can occur between 1 year and the next, or 1 May and the next May. And we actually quantify those arrows with numbers by censusing these populations over time. So that's part of the way we translate the life cycle into population biology and ultimately population growth rates. The progression within the year is, again, very typical of understory herbs. Now, this is not a spring ephemeral. It doesn't come and go in the early spring. It actually lasts through the growing season. It emerges around April to late May, and then expands its leaves during that time over a period of about a month. And then it's fixed in size at that point, and it basically becomes a photosynthesizing plant that is allocating energy to either flowering or expansion of the root underground. And ultimately, berries are formed. berries turn red. They start out green and turn red, and then they're dispersed in late September, mid to late September and October, and the leaves begin to senesce and turn yellow, and then it becomes dormant underground. So it's a deciduous plant that is undergoing this life cycle, very much like things like black cohosh and golden seal and other understory plants that you would commonly see under the eastern deciduous forest. This is the range of ginseng. People are often surprised how widespread it is, because when you read or hear about ginseng, you think it's a rare plant. But it extends from Quebec all the way down to Georgia, all the way over to Missouri and up to Minnesota. So it's a very widespread plant, but anywhere you do find it, it's never abundant. So it's kind of an unusual kind of rarity. Typically, rare plants are found in unusual restricted habitats like wetlands or serpentine soils or something like that, that makes the habitat rare. But in this case, the habitat is the eastern deciduous forest. And so it's actually found in eastern deciduous forest across that range, but it's never abundant wherever you find it. So that's an unusual kind of rarity. Now, conventional wisdom would say that it's found typically on north-facing rich cove forests. So if you go to a website and get some information about it, you would say, oh, that's where I would go looking for it. And that tells me what kind of forest I would need to find ginseng. But what we did was, early on in my lab studies, we went out and randomly sampled the eastern deciduous forest in the central part of ginseng's range. So this is mostly West Virginia. And what we found was that conventional wisdom broke down very fast. So at low elevations, it was actually western facing sites that had the most ginseng. And at mid elevations, it was eastern facing sites that had the most. And then at high elevations, there wasn't a real pattern there. But as you can see from this graph, north facing slopes definitely are not where ginseng is the most abundant. I think that might change depending upon the region. So I would expect in southern forests, where you're probably located, you might find that it's more true that they're found on north-facing cove forests. And then in the north, the far north, it actually is more likely to be on south-facing slopes. And all of that is just to ameliorate the temperature regime to be within ginseng's natural range. But it's much more widespread within the central part of its range than we had thought. Okay. What about, where is it found within those forests where we do find ginseng? And really what I'm asking here is, does ginseng grow well? And one of my graduate students spent a lot of time studying where ginseng grew well. And what she found was that the conventional wisdom, again, broke down. We thought, based upon what people told us, that ginseng would be most common under sugar maple, spice bush, and surrounded by rattlesnake fern, jack-in-the-pulpit, and other indicator species. But in fact, it was really only the presence of large tulip poplars that indicated better plant growth of ginseng. Spice bush and sugar maples actually tended to result in lower growth rates, probably due to shading. So we think that we understand why that is. It is found in those environments, but it doesn't actually grow better there. So if I were to go out and plant it, I wouldn't put it under spice bush or sugar maples. All right, so let's move to the big three conservation challenges. The first one that comes to mind is harvest. This is actually a photo of a pile of roots. It's 1,700 pounds of ginseng roots. And this photo was taken in 1929 in Buchanan, West Virginia. And if you look closely at that guy's hand and those roots, those are quite large roots compared to what we see today. Again, probably in the past, the plants were much larger. They were much more abundant. I don't think it would be, any dealer would have that kind of pile of roots today in a single shipment. But that I'm estimating is about 200,000 roots that were harvested. And in fact, the harvest goes back a long way. It goes back to 1715. And it actually can be attributed to this single person, Joseph Francois Lapiteau, who happened to be a Jesuit priest who was operating out of Quebec. And he was very interested in plants. He was, as a lot of those folks were, very interested in science. And he read about ginseng in China, which actually a fellow Jesuit priest had written about. And that fellow Jesuit priest also thought there probably would be similar plants in North America. And then Joseph Francois Lapiteau kind of went out looking for it. And it took him a few months to find it, but he interacted with some Native Americans and they actually said, oh yes, we have that plant. And they showed it to him and the rest is sort of history. So the early trade began in Quebec, and then when that was really harvested out, they moved into New England and then down the eastern seaboard and kind of gradually moved west in waves of harvest activity for right through the 1800s. And that was really the heyday of huge ginseng harvests, hundreds of thousands of pounds being exported every year. And what was supplying was the Asian ginseng market. So it turns out the Asians really valued American ginseng and paid huge bucks for it. And some early American millionaires made a lot of money on ginseng, trading ginseng. So it was actually very important to the early history of our country. And in that time, since the 1715 harvest, annual harvest started, it's been really important to rural people as a supplementary source of income. So it's a very important aspect of American culture that a lot of people are kind of unaware of. As I said, it ends up in the Asian market, and here are a few roots. I asked how much these roots were worth in a shop in Chinatown in New York City, and that was $750 for those 8 or 10 roots there. And in fact, there are stories of individual roots being worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, which sounds crazy, but some roots, if they're extremely old, are valued that highly. The average root is worth between $1 and $3, so much less than that, at least to the harvester at this end. But it's been an important part of Appalachian culture. In 1975, the US had just signed on to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Mouthful there, but CITES. And ginseng was of concern because people saw huge amounts of it being traded to China, and we didn't really know whether that was sustainable or not, but at least we thought it should be monitored. And so it was listed on Appendix 2, which allows the trade, but requires states to monitor it. And so the US Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for CITES, and they basically have offloaded the regulation of ginseng programs to individual states. And there are 19 states that have ginseng programs. US Fish and Wildlife Service just approves them over time. So we wanted to know, of course, is harvest detrimental? And we did use our population biology models very early on to compare no harvest on the left to non-compliant harvest, which is people harvesting out of season and basically ignoring the rules. Compliant harvest would be people that actually followed the rules of the state of West Virginia at that time. And then stewards would be people who kind of went above and beyond the rules to carefully plant the seeds, to take less than all of the plants that they could, in fact, only taking plants that were reproductive and so forth. What we found was that the non-compliant harvesters, of course, drove populations down rapidly, 15% per year. But even compliant harvesters who were actually following the rules, following the letter of the law at that time, would reduce the populations 8% per year due to their activities. Only the stewards were able to actually sustainably harvest the population. So, of course, encouraging stewardship behavior is what we've been all about ever since. Just to show you a couple of populations. So we've been following 30 populations over a lot of years, up to 18 or 19, actually 20 years now. And I've just pulled out a couple of them that showed harvest here. One of them showed repeated harvest. Population 6 here was harvested 4 times from 2005 to 2008. And you can see it drove the population down 80%. And this was actually one of our most healthy populations we had in our entire group. Population 3 was harvested once, and we saw over 20% drop by that one single harvest. And that has been sustained over time. So both these populations have not recovered from that harvest. When we looked more closely at the harvest events that we observed in our 30 populations, we found a lot of illegal behavior. 65% occurred on land where harvest is explicitly prohibited. 21% were out of season. 82% of harvest events included plants under the legal size limit. So you can see harvest is a real problem and one that needs to be addressed in conservation. The second huge problem we discovered was overbrowsing by white-tailed deer. And if you're familiar with forest recruitment, you're aware of this issue, but it applies to the understory as well. And you can see here on very visual evidence, on the left side, we have a photo taken at 7:02 p.m. in 2009. And this little buck is walking up and it totally defoliates this 4-pronged plant. We don't actually think deer prefer ginseng or particularly love it. It's just one of the things they munch on the forest floor, but they do browse a lot. So I've listed the 30 populations here, and we see the browse history average over a decade in each of these populations. The low is 1.6% of plants browsed by early August. And then the high is 67%. So, and these are actually underestimates because we don't harvest, or we don't census at the end of the season, the very end in October. So more are harvested than this, but by August, an average of 21%, a fifth of the population has been browsed. And people were kind of surprised at that. And we did show that this definitely affects the population viability on about an equal terms with harvest. So that was the big surprise there. So these aren't the greatest pictures, but I couldn't find my color pictures to show. We actually found in one population a population of ginseng on top of a rock. So on the right side, this is a gigantic 10-foot high rock that has actually a forest community on top of it. But that prevented the deer from getting up there. I don't know what made us crawl on top of that rock and look for ginseng, but we did, and there was a population up there. And around the rock, the deer were browsing at kind of an average rate, actually, for all of our populations. And we've seen the on-rock population grow over the last decade, and then the off-rock population decline. So we kind of had a natural exclosure experiment there that really was quite interesting in terms of demonstrating the effects of deer browse. The third big challenge that's looming more than affecting necessarily right now, although we're starting to see drought events and warm summers, excessively warm summers in certain sites. As everyone knows, CO2 levels have been rising. I think it's up over 30% since I was born in 1956, which is about where that graph starts. And of course, this is causing an increased propensity to have warm conditions, and that happens both in the winter and in the summer. And the key element here is that plants tend to be adapted to their local environment. So what this means is that when the climate changes rapidly, that specialization actually becomes a big liability. And we can see this in the response of ginseng populations to warmer than average years. So this graph takes a little explaining, but each of these curves represents a separate population, and they are varying around their temperature optimum. So just for example, one of our southern populations, the warmest population, has a mean temperature of about 81 degrees, but in warmer summers, the population growth rate drops. It also drops in cooler summers as well. So it tends to do best around the temperature in which it's growing. And so these are the northern populations on the left side of the graph at low temperatures. And the interesting thing about this is that they drop off as well when temperatures are warmer than average. And even though those are much cooler temperatures than the southern populations. So every population is locally adapted, and the species is not acting the same in different places. It's genetically adapted to the temperature regime at these sites, which means that when warming occurs, it's not going to just destroy the southern populations and the northern ones will do well. None of the populations along the range will do particularly well. So it's a problem across all the range that temperatures are increasing kind of directionally with climate change. Okay. Ginseng is also impacted by many other human-related factors, and I don't have time to go into all of them here. I'm running out of time as we speak, but I'll quickly go through timbering, strip mining and mountaintop removal, mining, and suburban sprawl and second home development. We've studied all of these things, and I would put these under the category of habitat degradation or loss. And I'm going to let Jen particularly talk about timbering and its effects, and I know that's one of your main interests. And then we have invasive species as well, which is a serious issue. So if you take a ginseng-centric view of the world, you can see it's being impacted by people kind of from all sides. And so when I talk about what does ginseng need in terms of conservation, what I think of is harvest first. It needs stricter harvest regulation and enforcement. But in a more positive light, I would like to see much more wild harvest substituted by wild growing by forest landowners. And I think this is where forest landowners can play a really key role, because the Asian market really values those wild looking roots. They don't want cultivated roots, or they won't pay nearly as much for them. And yet there are a lot of forests out there. And so wild growing could really actually help that. Obviously, kind of better management of deer populations. I call it holistic management, because this could involve greater hunting of does, for example, to keep populations lower. And if hunting can't do it, then perhaps reintroduction of predators that can do it. We don't want deer populations so high that disease becomes the way they are regulated. That's not good for ginseng. Mitigation of climate change. Obviously, we're not going to reduce climate change because of ginseng, but it's going to be one of the benefits, if we do address climate change seriously, that understory plants, I think generally, are going to do much better under a preserved climate like we have now. Finally, and this kind of leads into Jen's talk, promotion of preserved mature forests with large trees, canopy gaps, and well-developed soils. These things are going to be absolutely key to ginseng conservation in the future. And yeah, I would just point out that forests like that, you get the gestalt by looking at those pictures, are what we need more of to conserve ginseng. And if we have that, then this can happen. So I'm pointing to population 30, the yellow line on this graph here. Here are our 30 populations and what's happening. And you can see that on average, they're decreasing by over almost 30% over a decade. And yet there are populations that are increasing. Population 30 is one of those. And it is a relatively high elevation population that has not been harvested. It doesn't have a lot of invasive species. And even though it was timbered back in around 1920, 1910, in that range, it has large mature trees with well-developed soils and very little, and it does have gaps that are being formed by big trees falling out. So that mature forest kind of gestalt is what ginseng needs to do really well. And here it is, a population growing 65, almost 70% in a decade. So ginseng can do well under the right conditions. So with that, I'll kind of lead it to Jen and stop sharing my screen, and you can hopefully see hers.
Great, thanks, Jim. Yeah, as Jen gets her presentation all set and ready to go, just going to give a little introduction. Dr. Jennifer Chandler, Jen, actually recently joined the Forest Stewards Guild as the Southeast Region Manager after spending several years in academia. She received her BA in Business Administration from Transylvania University in 2004 and her BS in Biology from Northern Kentucky University in 2009, before completing her PhD under the mentorship of Dr. McGraw at West Virginia University in 2016. And her research has focused primarily on plant response to discrete and chronic disturbances including the response of American ginseng to both natural and man-made canopy disturbances, and the impact of invasive pest spotted lanternfly on woody plants in the forests of Pennsylvania. And so, Jen, whenever you're ready, we are ready for you. I think. All right, perfect.
Sorry about that. I was having trouble with my computer. Can everyone see the screen and hear me, Dakota?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So Dr. McGraw already gave you a fantastic review of ginseng biology and its cultural and economic importance, so I'm not going to cover that anymore. Dr. McGraw mentioned at the end the preservation of these old growth and mature forests. And that's a wonderful goal to strive toward. And I'm actually going to talk today about a little something different, how we can manage forests so that the ginseng still has the qualities that are found in ginseng grown in mature forests. So when I started grad school, I got really interested in forest disturbances, both natural disturbances and man-made, and really how those disturbances affected American ginseng. So I'm going to start with a very brief introduction, and then I'm going to give you a general overview of some of the things that I found in my work and in the work done by the McGraw Lab. So just to remind you about what Dr. McGraw mentioned, historic accounts suggest that ginseng was once far more abundant than it is today, and evidence for this is the precipitous decline in ginseng export from the late 1800s to the late 1900s. So overharvesting of ginseng, like Dr. McGraw said, is often described as the primary cause for decreases in population size and abundance. Nevertheless, extensive changes in forest structure and in ginseng habitat were occurring in parallel to overharvesting of this ginseng root. So this is a figure drawn from Dr. McGraw's book, which I'm actually going to mention at the end of this talk. And it represents a rough reconstruction of the percent of landscape in the eastern deciduous forest found in varying conditions from 1650 to the present time. And the data that were used to construct this figure were taken from multiple sources by Dr. McGraw. So it's interesting to take a look at this diagram and to think about ginseng habitat. As we move from 1650 to the present, the amount of mature forest, which was ginseng's assumed ideal habitat, diminishes. And it's replaced by habitat that's either unoccupied by ginseng, this permanently transformed land or agricultural land, or habitat that's perhaps suboptimal, these younger, more shaded, regrowing forests. So today I want to talk a little bit about one of the activities that has changed the landscape throughout the eastern US and the potential effects it may have on ginseng performance. So as we know, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, extensive clear-cut timber harvests removed the vast majority of old growth forests throughout the eastern US. And of course, these harvests affected both the forest canopy, but also the vegetation and soil at the forest floor. And they led to dramatic changes in the habitat of understory plants. Nevertheless, it's not known whether these substantial changes in forest structure contributed significantly to the massive declines in ginseng that we saw during that same time period. And it was really this historic timber harvest that motivated me to study the response of ginseng to canopy disturbances. I remember Jim giving me a really old historic book that talked about these clear cuts in West Virginia, and it really piqued my interest. So this is a theoretical model of ginseng performance viability as a function of canopy openness. And you're going to see this again at the end of the talk. The dotted line you see here represents a ginseng population that is neither growing in size or shrinking. It's stable. If you move above the dotted line, a population grows. If you move below, a population shrinks. The continued presence of natural ginseng populations following the clear cuts that occurred at the turn of the 20th century indicate that ginseng can survive under very sparse canopies. Conversely, the presence of natural ginseng populations under closed canopy second growth forests of today suggests that ginseng can also survive under very dense shade. Although ginseng is capable of surviving at these two extremes of canopy openness, performance is likely not optimal at either end of this disturbance spectrum. So it's fairly obvious that changes in forest canopy caused by timber harvest have profound effects on the success of understory species, including ginseng. But I wanted to know whether canopy disturbances caused by timber harvest are physiological stressors, or whether increases in light following harvest provide physiological benefits, particularly that lead to increased growth of these plants. So forgive me if this is oversimplified, but I want to make sure I'm covering all bases. The light environments of these closed canopy, undisturbed forests that we see a lot of consists of low levels of diffuse light, punctuated by patches of more intense transient light known as sunflex. And we've all walked through forests that are rich in sunflex. The light intensity in sunflex can be much greater than in diffuse. And sunflex do contribute significantly to carbon gain in understory plants. However, in the absence of disturbance, light is still the primary resource that limits understory productivity. So a 2013 study by Alex Wagner, who was a super talented undergraduate student in Dr. McGraw's lab, and Dr. McGraw, suggested that American ginseng is adapted to the dynamic heterogeneous light environments of old growth forests. So what I wanted to do is pick up where Wagner and McGraw's work with ginseng left off. And instead of understanding ginseng's response to these sunflex, I wanted to know how American ginseng responded to light levels and durations that far exceeded those found in sunflex. So this first study that I'm going to talk about took advantage of an existing natural population of ginseng that was located in an area that was prescribed a very small patch cut timber harvest as part of a larger study. And these are actually photos from that site, which was located in an experimental forest in West Virginia. And the harvest that I'm talking about in this study took place in late fall and winter of 2013. So the fantastic thing about this particular site was that I knew timber harvest was going to take place. Excuse me. So I was able to locate and measure these ginseng plants within the marked area the growing season prior to the harvest so that I could get a good understanding of a baseline for these plants. So I ended up taking hemispherical photos facing upward, and you can see the rig that I used here, to capture the forest canopy 20 centimeters above the forest floor, which is the average height of American ginseng on that site. So throughout this study and the next, the canopy that I reference is all understory, midstory, and tree canopy above a ginseng plant, not just the tree canopy, which is what we typically think of. So I took these images above each ginseng plant over a 3-year time period, the growing season just prior to the timber harvest and the 2 growing seasons after that. And I used some software to pull out some metrics. I chose to focus on percent canopy openness because it's a good ginseng-centric measure of canopy disturbances. So I was able to locate 34 ginseng plants on this site, and I made a lot of different measurements on them, 1 growing season before the harvest took place, and then again the 2 growing seasons after. Among other variables that I won't talk about in this talk, I calculated total leaf area, and you can see an example of measuring the leaves here. So I calculated total leaf area of each plant, and I actually used those data to calculate relative growth rate, which is simply the change in leaf area over time. I also used a Lycor gas exchange system to take physiological measurements on each of the 2- and 3-leaved individuals because there were no 4-leaved individuals in this population. for each of the growing seasons, the season before harvest and the two after. And variables that I looked at in this study included photosynthesis, respiration, and stomatal conductance. And you can actually see in these photos show the measurements being made on the same set of plants before the timber harvest, and then again the growing season after. And you can kind of see the growth of these weedy species coming in. Okay, so let's look at the bigger picture first. How does relative growth rate of the plants, in other words, the change in leaf area over time, respond to canopy changes caused by the patch cut harvest? I wanted to determine if and how the change in relative growth rate on the y-axis varied as a function of the change in percent canopy cover on the x-axis between the summer before the timber harvest and the summer after the timber harvest, because this is the time interval that would have affected overall relative growth rate in this study. So on this graph, for example, if we look at this individual plant, a lower value on this x-axis would indicate only a small increase in canopy openness as a result of the timber harvest. But if we look at this guy over here, a higher value of x indicates a much larger increase in canopy openness as a result. So this regression analysis indicated that greater increases in canopy openness resulted in greater increases in growth over the study period. So we see growth stimulation at least within the range of change in canopy openness that we observed at this site. Of course, it's important to keep in mind that the canopy in this population was not completely opened up, at least when we're thinking about the canopy above a small herb. There was some residual mid-story and understory cover, as well as shading from the edges of this small patch cut. In fact, when averaged across all of the ginseng plants in this site, the canopy went from about 15% openness above the ginseng to approximately 36% openness. So this was in no way equivalent to, for example, a large-scale clear cut. And in fact, the trend that we saw would likely not hold up if canopies were opened up far more drastically. Okay, so we're seeing a growth stimulation, at least so far as leaf area goes. But I also wanted to see what's happening physiologically to elicit that response. So I dug into the physiology of these ginseng plants a little bit. And I'm going to try to explain this figure briefly. This figure shows light response curves from ginseng plants that were present on the sites for all 3 growing seasons. So for example, a light response curve for all the plants the year before the timber harvest, 1 year after the timber harvest, and 2 growing seasons after the timber harvest. So what we're looking at are plots of net photosynthetic rate as a function of essentially the amount of photosynthetically active light that's hitting the surface. Generally and far simplified, the higher the curve, the higher the maximum rate of photosynthesis. So physiological stimulation of these ginseng plants would have been evident by increases in photosynthesis after the patch cut harvest. And we did see evidence for stimulation. While we saw no difference in the net photosynthesis the summer after timber harvest relative to the summer before timber harvest, so no effect immediately, maximum photosynthesis increased by about 67% 2 summers after the harvest relative to the summer before. So we saw a stimulation 2 growing seasons after the harvest took place. Although we saw this stimulation, we also saw signs of stress, at least initially. So I noted signs of physiological stress the growing season directly after the timber harvest. And these signs included increased respiration rates, thick reddened leaves that you can see in these photos, and also earlier than usual senescence. And this is a picture of some senescing plants. Upon seeing these signs, one could be tempted to assume that this type of timber harvest negatively impacts ginseng physiology and growth. But my analysis indicated that this was actually not the case. In fact, individuals appeared well acclimated to the reduced canopy cover and higher light 2 summers or 2 growing seasons after the timber harvest. And evidence for this better acclimation was again that increase in maximum rate of photosynthesis, baseline normal respiration rates, and stomatal conductance that was greater 2 summers after the patch cut than any other time. So based on these findings, American ginseng may be aptly classified as a slow opportunist. Delayed acclimation to higher light is a consequence of American ginseng having determinate growth and leaves that are preformed based on prior carbon storage. So some plants like tomatoes are able to increase their above ground vegetation within a single growing season based on resource availability. However, American ginseng is not able to do that. Its determinate growth prevents these individuals from acclimating within a single growing season. And in fact, by the time acclimation occurs, the second growing season out, the understory and midstory are already starting to close in. So as a result of this, acclimation consistently lags behind canopy changes. Nevertheless, American ginseng is an opportunist whose physiology and growth benefit from rapid, discrete increases in light availability. In fact, although this study only dealt with one population, it does begin building a strong case that suggests ginseng is light limited in the absence of canopy disturbances. So the patch cut study suggests that ginseng physiology and growth responded positively to at least one type of canopy disturbance, albeit at a time lag. My next study that I'll talk about explored the response of some other variables, including survival, growth again, and some reproductive measures to various moderate severity timber harvest events. So the sites selected for this study were selected based on the presence of natural ginseng populations and also the implementation of timber harvest. And I'm going to discuss 4 populations. I've given them just generic numbers here due to the conservation status of ginseng. These populations differed in land ownership and they differed in the type of harvest that occurred. And in fact, specific prescriptions and amount of tree biomass removed, aren't known for all the sites. One of the sites, for example, was an experimental 17-inch diameter limit harvest. 2 were high graded. So what I chose to do, since my main focus was the ginseng, I chose to focus again on the mean percent canopy cover over the ginseng plants the year after the harvest as that meaningful ginseng-centric way to quantify disturbance severity above these plants. Initial population sizes at each one of these sites differed. We had as many as almost 300 ginseng at one site and as few as about 40. And in addition, the physical characteristics of each site varied. So I was extremely fortunate in this study. 2 of these sites actually contained ginseng populations that the McGraw lab had been following for years, whose timber just happened to be harvested and we didn't know it was going to be harvested. And these long-term data sets provide a baseline of timber harvest effect throughout this study. So I'm going to talk about a few variables. I quantified survival, and individuals were counted as dead if they did not reemerge 2 years in a row. Again, I looked at relative growth rate, the change in leaf area over time, and I looked at the proportion of flowering individuals or sexually mature individuals that actually produce seeds. And I looked at this for each of these sites over the entire study period. So let's talk first about survival. Survival at these harvested sites was generally lower the year after the harvest than at 12 undisturbed control sites over the same time period. When we look at the 2 harvested sites with long-term ginseng records, and we have percent of individuals surviving from those 2 sites, we determined that survival decreased from on average about 88% in the 3 years prior to the timber harvest to a little over 75% in the 2 years after timber harvest. One of the other sites was a bit of an anomaly because survival was particularly low. Only about 40% of the ginseng survived. Based on field observations, it seems likely that plants at this site were more desiccated, they were dried out. and also the plants were lost due to fairly extensive soil disturbance. So ginseng roots only occupy the top several inches of soil, and they're really susceptible to alterations to the forest floor. Based on observations in the field, ginseng mortality was greatest in places where the soil profile was destroyed or compacted during extraction. Mortality is high in and near landings, in areas where soil was displaced as logs were skidded across the forest floor, and also in situations where harvest was performed during a time period where the soils were particularly susceptible to damage, like when they weren't well frozen. I also found that mortality following harvest differed based on a plant's size, and death was far more likely in one-leafed and two-leafed individuals, and far less likely in adult three-leafed and four-leafed individuals. While these larger plants showed signs of stress, and they did senesce quite a bit earlier in the fall, just after the canopy was opened up, they had enough energy stored to reemerge the following season, whereas the seedlings and juvenile plants oftentimes did not. So of course, this mortality isn't ideal, but because of the persistence of larger, more reproductive individuals after timber harvest, there will likely be a promotion and a population recovery after the initial mortality. So now I wanted to know if those individuals that were able to survive grew larger after the timber harvest than they did when the canopy was relatively undisturbed, because that prior study suggested that this might be the case. So when I look at the short-term growth response using all of the populations, I found that relative growth rate, again, change in leaf area over time, increased dramatically after harvest when compared to the pre-harvest state. And this pattern was the same at each of these unique sites that received unique harvests. In other words, there was a proportional increase at relative growth rate among all of these sites. Additionally, the data from the two long-term sites indicate that relative growth rate was over 3 times greater in the 2 years following timber harvest as it was 3 years prior. So following with the results of that last study, generally if plants survived the initial harvest, relative growth rate tend to increase fairly strongly. Next, I wanted to think about seed production and reproduction. And while I measured a few different things, I'm only going to talk about one today. And one way that I investigated this was by using the data from those two long-term populations. So I looked at the percent of the flowering individuals that were actually able to produce seeds. We determined that the percent of those individuals that produced seeds declined the first year following timber harvest, but actually began increasing each year after. So in fact, by the 3rd year of growing season after the timber harvest, the proportion of flowering individuals that produce seed actually surpassed the pre-harvest values. Initial decreases in the number of individuals producing seeds were likely caused by desiccation of the ginseng inflorescence, or the flower stalk, due to higher light, lower humidity, and also higher temperatures at the forest floor in the growing season directly after harvest. However, in the years following, a decent number of adult individuals produced abnormally large seed sets. Now, what does this mean for the future of seedlings in these populations? Well, Wagner and McGraw's study found that germination was actually negatively related to sunflex. So that's still to be decided. So in this, we see a general pattern of light gap stimulation in these plants when exposed to moderate levels of canopy disturbance. Of course, as ground and shrub layers begin filling in after the timber harvest, the ginseng and similar understory plants are going to be overtopped and heavily shaded. And so stimulation will likely only last for a short period of time. So in this after harvest picture, the regeneration that you see was actually well above my head. And so the forest floor was really shaded. Nevertheless, harvest does stimulate physiological and growth processes in American ginseng. And if care is taken to reduce initial mortality, moderate levels of harvest may enhance ginseng population performance. So I'm going to revisit this curve that I showed at the beginning. I've just added a lot of stuff to it this time. So we're still looking at population performance, and we're still looking at canopy openness. Based on the work that's been done with ginseng, it seems individual growth and population successes may be modeled as a function of canopy openness, with maximum performance occurring after moderate disturbances. So populations located under dense evergreen canopies are expected to perform poorly relative to populations in sunfleck-rich deciduous forests. However, performance in both of these scenarios is likely suboptimal due to light limitation. Performance is optimized when canopies are moderately disturbed, such as the case with natural disturbances like small-scale wind throw, ice storms, lightning strike events, defoliation, but also timber harvests that mimic these types of natural disturbances. In fact, in a separate study, I've focused on changes in population size due to moderate severity natural canopy disturbances, the kind that we would expect in old growth forests that Dr. McGraw was talking about. And those results suggest that transient increases in light do in fact lead to sustained positive impacts on population. Although not directly quantified in this research, canopy disturbance at the highest end of the spectrum, for example, clear-cut harvests, will likely elicit decreases in population level performance. And this is due to initial damage caused by high light, drying out of seeds in the seed bank, drying out of plants, and eventual deep shade caused by fast-growing intolerant species. So, working on what Dr. McGraw said, in addition to preserving these mature forests, I think the major takeaway from this work is that ginseng can benefit from management that minimizes forest floor disturbance and mimics natural disturbances common to these mature forests in the eastern US. So some uneven age silviculture, such as single tree selection and group selection, which do mimic small scale natural canopy disturbances, may be a really good fit for landowners who have multidimensional goals, including the continued production of valuable timber, the maintenance of native biodiversity, and also the conservation of ecologically, economically, and culturally valuable herbs such as American ginseng. So I do want to just quickly acknowledge the folks that helped me in the field and helped me just work through all this stuff almost, 5 years ago. Dr. McGraw, of course, lab mates, including Amy Arushka, Jesse Bree Turner, and Alex Wagner, and then folks who are on my committee as well. One more thing I want to point out, because I would be remiss if I didn't. I do want to mention that Dr. McGraw recently published a wonderful book. And this book that talks about wild American ginseng is unique in that it expertly explains the decades-long work that Dr. McGraw has done with American ginseng all over the eastern United States. And it's done so in a way that's accessible to the general public. It's available at Amazon. And if you have questions about it or you just want any more information, jot down Dr. McGraw's email, jmcgraw56@gmail.com, and he'll be happy to answer them. And spoiler alert, if you buy the book, no big deal, but I'm mentioned in the first and last chapter. With that, we will take any questions for either Dr. McGraw or myself.
Great, thank you so much, Jen. That was awesome, and thank you, Dr. McGraw, as well. If anybody has any questions, looks like we have time for a couple. If you just want to type them into the chat box, and I can read them aloud for you, and they'll be answered. Oh wow, looks like we got a long question. Okay, so from Sean Swartz, one of the first questions that he has, I think for you, Jen, or Dr. McGraw, if you have the answer as well, is what was the initial basal area of these group selections?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Sean. So I don't remember off the top of my head the initial basal area. I do have that information in a paper. So if you want to perhaps put your email address in this chat window, I'll look that up for you, and I will, I'll let you know. And I see some of the other questions. Dakota, I'll let you continue, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I was just going to go on and read the second one if you want to answer that. It was, how large were the group selections? And then part 3 was, did you look at ginseng in the margins of the groups?
Mhm.
As
Yeah,
compared
so
in, yeah, Jen, if you want to answer that.
the group selections were 0.162 hectares. So they were really small. They were really small patches, and I actually did look at ginseng in the margins. So some of the ginseng were in the margins, and some were out kind of in the interior of the patch cuts. And I do have some other analyses that looked at those responses based on the amount of canopy cover above each one of those individual plants in a paper actually in Ecologia. So yeah, I did look at those.
Great. And then I want to go on to another question from Kyle asked, how does the presence of other understory associates impact growth during the canopy disturbances?
So how does the presence of other understory associates impact growth during canopy disturbances? That's a really good question. So when we were the season after these canopy disturbances, depending on the extent of the disturbance, we would see a lot of, actually one site was full of ailanthus, and it was completely shading out the ginseng. We also saw myelominate and rubus and what was it, gallium, I think, in some of the sites. So that's part of why these stimulations in growth and physiological response are likely to be short-lived, because even in the understory, these other plants are able to grow far quicker than the ginseng and shade them out.
Great, thank you. So it is 1 o'clock, so I do want to let folks go if they need to be somewhere else. But Jen and Dr. McGraw have agreed to stay on for a couple more minutes to answer some questions if people want to stay on. But if people need to go, that's totally fine. This webinar will be available on the Guild's webinar library, so you could watch it anytime you want and see these questions and come back to them. But let's answer just a couple more questions in the next couple minutes. One is from Ken, asked, how does ginseng respond to prescribed fire? If you know the answer to that question, Jen or Dr. McGraw.
So I can field this one, and you can hear me okay?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so the short answer is we don't know. At the end of my book, I compiled a long list of scientific questions that we do not have any answers to yet because we've never looked into it. And I'm embarrassed to say I forgot that one. Even though I've thought about it many times, I just never had a student looking for a project that, took that one on. So it's a really good question. Because of the underground route, if it's not a severe, extremely hot fire, I suspect they survive that fire just fine. But what I don't know is whether the release of nutrients from the fire and whether the recruitment that could occur would actually be stimulated by the fire. I just can't say. So great question, and I'm hoping that it will get studied. And so really good question. We don't know.
All right, thank you, Dr. McGraw. I think I'll just take one more question before we all head out here. From Rich, has something to say. I think the understory response to harvest could be significant. For example, initially more light and eventually less. And here we can get strong sugar maple seedling response to canopy gaps. Any thoughts on this in terms of eventual adverse impacts due to increased shade on ginseng?
Yeah, so Jen may have comments on this as well, but I do think that if you kind of look at that big broad history graph that Jen showed at the beginning, that early successional forest that you get can really impact the long-term dynamics over decades of early succession of the forest. So really dense tulip poplar stands of young trees that have not thinned out yet, or sugar maple stands could really adversely affect and produce sort of a shade squeeze on the understory, including ginseng. So I think that's a really important question. And I think in terms of looking at the broad impact of that huge amount of harvest that occurred at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, it's actually not so much the immediate impacts of harvest that were detrimental. It was much more the dense successional stands that occurred after that time that were likely just slowly depleting populations over time. So really good question. Jen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree on that very much. And one thing I would add to that is, well, actually, I think you covered it. I was going to add something, but I think you already covered it. So never mind.
So we also did a study where we directly planted ginseng under sugar maple and under black walnut and under ailanthus. And we had an incredibly weird result, which we think we understand now, at least somewhat. And that is that it did the worst under sugar maple. It did reasonably well under black walnut, which we thought might be allelopathic. And it did really quite well under ailanthus, an invasive tree. And we think that really has to do with light, but it also might have to do with the suppression of certain disease fungi and other organisms by the allelopathic chemicals produced by black walnut and ailanthus. But that we didn't follow on after that study to really dissect what was going on there, but we did have multiple points of evidence that sugar maple was suppressing ginseng growth through heavy shade.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen and Dr. McGraw, for joining us today. And thanks everybody who has also joined us today and listened to these great things. And I hope you all have a great weekend and a great rest of your day. And yeah, just thanks for joining us. And if you have any additional questions or anything, feel free to email me or Jen or Dr. McGraw. I just put my email in the chat box. And yeah, thank you all for joining us and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Dakota.